some days there's just a real silence and stillness in the room. Did you feel that today? Some days it isn't there, and I blame you. Some days it's just there in the room. So the Queen Bee, way better than Captain America, right? Do you have any questions? Go ahead.
What's the best way to read a fairy tale now as an adult? Because I love reading fairy tales, and I was hoping that they would do the same, because I feel great after I read them, but I didn't realise that now they have a bit more, it's harder to get into the unconscious. So is there anything that I can do to read it that way, or maybe ask myself, I don't know.
So the question is, how does one read the fairy tale as an adult? And she says, now she's realising there's more to it than she thought before, but how can we access that unconscious thing? I think you just have to come to the course that I do next year on fairy tales.
Is it in Thailand or here?
Well, if I come back here, I'd like to do it here. Not all just fairy tales, but stories from different traditions. It's difficult. The way that I would usually do the stories is with a small group, and then I would tell the story and with clear instructions on the people there not to use their conscious mind, the thinking. Forget what you think about it, and try to feel each particular element. So when it comes to the anthill, you might ask, well, how do you know that this is about thoughts? Well, you feel it. You know that symbol in the story is something that happens inside you. That's how the stories work. So what does it feel like having a million ants running around inside you? There is no other possibility for it to be than thoughts. So for every element in the stories, just internalize it. How does that feel if it's something inside me? And then you start to pick it up. There are certain motifs, and these particular or story elements. And these elements will get passed from story to story, and sometimes they're very key and central to the story. And sometimes they seem to be just thrown in there like by the by. For example, the bees, the two brothers wanted to smoke the bees out. Is the smoke significant? You often come across this motif of something that's smoking, something that's fogging, or very often something that's plucking out eyes, or you meet a blind person. So this motif of being unable to see is very common in the tales. In this particular story, it was not central to the story, but it is one of those elements. And so as you pick out these key elements, you start to see that actually you get used to these particular symbols, and then it starts to make more sense. But here's a question for you. Is it better to understand it? Is it better to have had do you enjoy this story more now that I've explained it? Or would you have enjoyed it more if I didn't explain it? I like the explanation. I like to understand how and why they work. But I also like the mystery. I like the ones that I can't understand. And then sometimes later something clicked into place and I get it. Or sometimes you see that same motif in a different story and then you get what the motif means. Sometimes you get these motifs that are kind of relegated and almost dead in the story. That happens too from time to time. Jack and the Beanstalk have a significant part. The fairy godmother, who doesn't appear in the classic English version, but does in other versions. And she always arrives with two peacocks pulling her carriage. I really want to know what peacocks mean. So I haven't come across that answer yet, but I will. Somewhere along the line, I'll find out what peacocks meant to people, in their psychology. So, in some versions of Jack and the Beanstalk, the peacocks, either they're just mentioned once or not at all. So sometimes these motifs kind of die out. So, that's just my advice. Read stories, but pick out these elements that you find in all the stories. Anybody else? Go ahead.
I was mentioning about the panther by Rilke, and you were talking about things within things within things. And that's an animal within a cage, within the circus, within a city, within a country. It's all about containing the artistic spirit and the impediments to be able to express yourself and so.
Yeah. I don't know that story, but
It's a poem by Rilke.
For a while I was always a bit cautious on stories and fairy tales because I seem to cherry pick. And I was just thinking, well, I should be an expert on fairy tales, but do you know how many fairy tales there are? I mean, I've got, I think, 60 versions of Cinderella. I did a talk on that, and it's like a week just doing Cinderella. Snow White, I mean, there's hundreds of versions. Rumpelstiltskin is one of my favourites. Then there's tomorrow night I'm doing the talk on Roman mythology, on Pandora's box. Do I have to be an expert in Greek mythology and Russian fairy tales and German fairy tales and Buddhists? I mean, they can't do it. And I figured out only a couple of weeks ago, I'm not really interested in being a master of fairy tales. What I'm interested, or understanding a particular lineage, what I'm interested in is those stories that relate to our past. And so many stories don't. Captain America doesn't relate to my spiritual path. So I'm not so interested. However, there are common elements even in those kind of stories. And some writers today, I mean, people miss good writers. People miss just how well written some things are. And my favourite TV show of all time, I feel a little embarrassed telling you. My favourite TV show of all time was Gilmore Girls. I love that. I love that so much. Amy Sherman Palladino, she's just such a good writer. She's a fantastic writer. And she puts so many things in her stories that one time the protagonist, the Gilmore, she has got married to her former husband, but we know that she has to marry the guy in the cafe. We knew that for 8 seasons that she has to. You know they're making a new Gilmore Girls out this year, making 4 new episodes. I won't be doing any Dharma talks on those nights. So we know that she has to marry the guy in the cafe, but she's married her ex-husband. And so in the story they have to get us to break us from the ex-husband and make us realise that's the wrong man. And in the story what she did, she had a stray dog come and follow her around. And at first she thought, oh, isn't he lovely, this little stray dog, I love him, and he's wonderful. But kept following her around, and after the end she's like, okay, go away. And she's talking about her husband, right, her former husband who'd been following her around, but what she really needs to do is go off to the other person. So good writers will put these elements into stories very, very deliberately and very specifically. Anybody else have a question? Something to comment on?
Like great music is, it sort of has the appearance of being simple, but it's actually very complicated and just done perfectly.
Yeah, it's a good analogy. Music has so many elements. But you hear one song unless you're a musician.
Bhante, some teachers talk about the chitta, and I've always heard it described as the heart-mind in Buddhism, but then you talked about the ego and the id, and recently I've been thinking about my own experience where my head says one thing and the heart sort of, is a completely different scenario. I was just wondering if you could expand on that Buddhist context of whether they're considered just one or two.
The word citta, as he says, is translated as heart or mind, but has several different meanings. One of the meanings is the state of mind. So citta nupassana, when you're watching the mind, according to the text, he says, is the mind in lust, in greed, in hatred? Is it expanded? Is it contracted? Is it open? Is it closed? Is it bright? Is it dull? So that's one meaning of the word citta, means the state of your mind. The other meaning of the word citta is that thing that is permanent and indestructible. So that's the mind without an object. So in every moment of consciousness you have the thing that you are conscious of, but you also have the mind that is conscious. And we are only ever aware of the objects that we're conscious of and never aware of the consciousness itself. So in citta and the ramana, the citta really represents the enlightened mind, but that we miss, that we can't see, because we're so caught up in things that you can see, hear, smell, taste and touch. The thing about the battle, writers have known for a long time that a human being is not a single whole being. We are a mass of warring drives and confusion, and we want one thing but we want another thing, and we want to have this but we want that as well, and we have all these warring things fighting for dominance in us. So writers all the way back past the Greeks have said the heart of drama is
conflict.
Thank you. Conflict. And so that's what makes things interesting. That's what we're interested in when we're conflicted. So writers always put their characters into positions where they're conflicted. Where the character knows exactly what to do, it's not a good story. At Gilmore Girls, she married her husband, her ex-husband, because he's safe and he loves her, but she also fancies the guy in the cafe. So where there's conflict, we like the story. Where there's no conflict, we don't care about the story. So writers have always known this, but it wasn't until Freud that it started to get analysed. And a big part of his theory was that we have so many conflicting parts in our being that psychology and our life is trying to mesh them into a whole. We have this lifelong battle to try and become an integrated human being, which he said was impossible, but he said we should still try. So you have various different drives in you. You have the sex drive, you have the pleasure drive, you have the hate drive, you have the habit. At the end of Freud's life, he was dying from oral cancer, probably from a lifetime of taking cocaine around the gums. He was a lifelong cocaine addict. But they didn't consider cocaine an addictive, harmful drug at that time. And he recognized at the end of his life, he said, there's another drive that I never noticed, and he called it the nirvana drive. And this was the drive for your own destruction. And he said there's something peaceful and attractive about the idea that you can cease to be. And I found this also to be true. Anyway, so he really started to analyze what are these drives that push you and pull you, and that you're not an integrated being that you pretend you are. Anybody else comment on the story? Some elements of the story you agree with, you disagree with, you liked or you didn't like? Going once.
I like the stone part when you get stoned. I mean, I like that sort of the way that explains it, because it's like that fight and flight. Like, you know, when you get into a situation you don't know what to do, or
So remember Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe? When they get to the kingdom where the White Witch has been and everything is turned to stone. So this is a really common motif. And the devastated kingdom, or the wasteland, is this element of the story. That it's not just you yourself, not just the character that has to solve a problem, but when the character has solved the problem, everything will come right. So with all these stories, there is this devastated wasteland, and this one character has to do the one thing, and then the entire wasteland will be restored. So Lord of the Rings was exactly this motif, right? Turn to stone, yeah, literally when everything stops. Journey to the West had an interesting take on this. They had a horse and a monk that sits on the horse. Now a horse represents thought, specifically attention, attentive thought. And the monk was representing the ego, and every time they got into a difficult situation, the monk would fall off the horse. So you have this common kind of theme that's something to describe the problem. And often the problems are unrelated to the person or the hero or heroine. Again, every one of these elements is something inside you. So this wasteland is something that you experience in that time of fear, in that time of dread. Most often in that time of the impossible task. So all these stories, you have something that the person needs to do that's impossible for them to do. Okay. What I liked, and I'm not sure if I'm putting it into the story myself, but I liked that our character in this story sat down on a stone and started crying. Because he's going back to that stone thing again, that same thing of being frozen, still, can't move. What can you do but sit and cry? Mm-hmm.
But it's funny, I actually see that as the inverse to you, actually. I see the crying as dissolving the stone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the point of surrender, and that from that point of surrender, you automatically know that the solution is going to come.
In Japanese poetry and art, the leaves falling off a tree represent the thoughts. So often you have
leaves falling off a tree represent thoughts. I always had that saying that when you fall off the twig, that means you died. Okay, last one, and then we'll wrap
It's
up.
not really a question, it's more like just a comment. I still like to listen to fairy stories. I mean, obviously I'm not a child, but I still like to listen to a fairy story like a child, like just listen to the story, and you kind of know what's going to happen in a way. I mean, you know the dwarf's going to get all the goodies at the end because he's the unfortunate one, and it's traditional in fairy stories that the downtrodden or the insignificant one, you know, who's doing all the right things will get his just reward or her just rewards. And knowing that that's coming is kind of a satisfying thing in a way. You still want to hear how it's done. You want to hear about the journey. And when it all happens, at the end, there's a sense of just kind of, it's a good feeling. It's resolved how it was meant to be. And that's what I guess I like about fairy stories.
Yeah. Yeah, well put, exactly so. I do have a few stories that will go the opposite way to what you think. So things don't have to end well for them to be just. I mean, there's sort of, they tend to be just, I think, often. They're not, do fairy stories that end up unjustly? Not really, but it depends on your viewpoint. Like, I think it's unjust that the two brothers got a princess.
Yeah, they didn't really deserve it.
It's a little...
That's right. That's spoiled.
I would have kept all three princesses.
You might say when they get the children, that's the bad karma coming to affect them.
Yeah, it's nice, and I'm the same as you. I like to just listen to it, and there is a sense of resolution, and there's a sense of everything fitting into its place, even though they're very bizarre stories. Sometimes you have to go back to older versions of the stories to really get the meaning also. So there's some very good websites, and you can track, if you have a particular story, you can track it through the ages. So Rumpelstiltskin is a very old story and has Russian versions. The Russians and the Germans were the best at this. By far, they were the best at this. Okay, I think we're good for this week. Look after your thinking, look after your desires, and look after your spiritual aspirations, and everything else will work itself out. Or at the very least, you'll get the key to the princess's bedroom. Okay.